All right, so now that we have covered the different lobes of the brain, let's cover some specialized areas of the cortex or specialized cortices within those particular lobes. Let's start with Broca's area. If you look at the posterior inferior left frontal lobe, you will find this area right here on this image, and down here, this blue area here, and that is referred to as Broca's area. This is the part of your brain that is responsible for our expressive language, meaning our ability to take the meaning of what we want to say and put that meaning into words. So Broca's area finds the words to communicate the meaning that you want to communicate. Think about when you have like something on the tip of your tongue. You know the meaning of what you want to communicate. It's not that you don't know the meaning of what you want to communicate, it's that you can't find that word to communicate it. That's a within normal failure of Broca's area. If you take that to a pathological level, that's what happens to people when they have a stroke at Broca's. And that's Broca's aphasia. The flip side of that coin is this area right here in green on the superior posterior temporal lobe. And back here you can see it a little bit in red, and that's Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is the part of your left temporal lobe that receives the auditory signal of speech and allows you to understand the words that that auditory signal, the words that those sounds that you're hearing represents. So if you have a stroke at Wernicke's area, you can hear speech, but you can't assign words to it. So Wernicke's area is responsible for your auditory reception of language. Similarly, let's mention the angular gyrus, which is in orange right here, but I think it's probably a little bit more posterior. But it's at the general intersection of the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. So it's always around here. The angular gyrus does for reading what Wernicke's does for listening. And what I mean by that is the occipital lobe receives visual signal of some squiggles on a page that probably represent words. The occipital lobe hands that information off to the angular gyrus. The angular gyrus takes that visual signal of letters on a page and assigns words to it. Words to those letters, words to those little squiggles on the page, and allows you to derive words from the letters, the written words that you're seeing. So the angular gyrus is responsible for visual reception of language, which is reading. Someone that has a stroke at the angular gyrus will be able to see the letters on the page, but to them it looks like a foreign language. They suddenly won't be able to read their native language. So those are three primary language areas. Let's talk about this most posterior gyrus of the frontal lobes. That is the motor strip, or also referred to as the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is that part of your cortex that is largely responsible for generating motor plans for the volitional movement of your body. So when I am moving my hand, this movement is being generated at the opposite primary motor cortex. Similarly, the first gyrus of the parietal lobe is known as the sensory cortex, or the primary sensory cortex, or the sensory strip. The sensory strip is that part of your cortex that receives raw afferent sensory information from your body. So all that sensory information, taction, proprioception, your sense of pain, physical pain, your sense of hot and cold, all that gets sent from your body to be received at the primary sensory cortex, or the sensory strip. That's the part of your brain that receives it. And then the sensory cortex hands all that raw, unprocessed information off to the rest of the parietal lobe for processing. So it's the rest of the parietal lobe that processes that information, that tells you what it is that you're feeling. In a similar way, the primary hearing cortex, or the primary auditory cortex, is just anterior to vernix area on the left, and you also have one on the right. These are the parts of your temporal lobes that receive that raw information from your ears, raw auditory sensory information. And in the left hemisphere, the primary auditory cortex hands that sensory information about speech off to vernix area to be processed, to be understood. On the right temporal lobe, the primary auditory cortex hands off the signal for environmental sounds. So the sound of the door closing, that goes to your right temporal lobe and is received at the right primary auditory cortex and is processed in the right temporal lobe to allow you to understand the meaning of the sound that you heard. So the right temporal lobe allows you to understand the meaning of environmental sounds, whereas the left temporal lobe, vernix area, allows you to interpret the meaning of the speech sounds that you hear. And between vernix area and Broca's area, there are bands of white matter, meaning bands of neurons, nerves, you can think of them as wires, that connect vernix area to Broca's area. The function of the arcuate fasciculus, this is the arcuate fasciculus, the function of the arcuate fasciculus is that it allows you to transmit words received and processed at vernix area, words that you hear. It allows you to transmit those words from the temporal lobe anteriorly to Broca's area for repetition, direct repetition of those words. So if you have a stroke at the arcuate fasciculus, then that individual is going to hear the sounds. Those sounds are going to be received at the left primary auditory cortex. Those speech sounds are going to be processed at vernix area. So that person is going to still be able to understand the speech that he or she is hearing. But the individual is not going to be able to transmit those words to the front of his or her brain to repeat them directly. What they can do is, since they did understand the words that were spoken to them, they derived meaning from the word. So they understood the words. They transmit that meaning to the front of the brain. They use Broca's to find their own words to communicate that meaning. So they can paraphrase what they hear, but they can't repeat it directly.